All right, we've got a great lineup for you today. We've got pros, we've got Joes, we've got tactics, we've got technique. We got a little bit of everything. So sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Hey there, it's Mark Renneson. Welcome to another episode of Pickleball Today. All right, being able to play a good dink is a really important skill in pickleball. When your opponents are at the net being all scary, looking to pounce, you want to give them something that they can't really attack very easily, and that's where a dink comes in. Keeping that ball low and slow, forcing your opponents to hit up, it serves a lot of the same purposes as a drop. It limits your opponent's ability to cause trouble for you, especially when they use speed. But while it's great to be able to play that dink, it's also really nice to be able to surprise your opponent with a fastball, to catch them sleeping. Let's take a look at some of the things we need to do to be great at disguising our flick. Okay, so we all know how important a dink is. Keep that ball low to the ground, low to the net, force your opponents to hit up. But isn't it nice when every once in a while you can just speed things up? We see Catherine Peranteau right here. Great examples of using speed. Here's Matt Wright on the backhand side. Nicely done. So let's think a little bit about some of the technical elements related to dinking and flicking and find out where we can find some commonalities and where we can find some distances. Did I say distances? I meant differences. All right, here we go, taking a look at a self-fed forehand dink followed by a self-fed forehand flick. So notice how many things are similar here. This is on the backhand as well. How I set up my feet, how I set up my body, how I set up my paddle. Heck, even how I hold my paddle, the grip I use should be constant throughout. So as we take a look here, we've got an open stance. My feet are facing forward toward the net. I've laid back my wrist. This is important here. The laid back wrist is a crucial element to both the dink and the flick. And I make contact out front. Again, here we see this is the flick about to come. The setup looks almost identical. What's the difference? Well, there's just that little acceleration at the last second going forward. Everything else stays the same. Let's take a look at the backhand here. Most people find this a little bit harder to do on the backhand, tougher to generate speed. Again, we see the same open stance setup. We see the same laid back wrist, the same continental grip. The change here is this little acceleration. You can see the paddle face starting to change so that the ball stays a bit lower. And then that forward acceleration. Let's take a look at these side by side. And again, you should see that it's very hard to tell before the ball is struck which ball is coming. Here's another angle we can look at. Again, what I'm trying to do here is make the disguise as similar as possible between these two shots. It's generally a good idea to set up as though you're dinking the ball and then surprise them with the speed up. If you look like you're going to hit fast and instead hit slow, well, that's actually, it might surprise them, but that's usually a nice surprise that you give them. So it's typically a good idea to set up as though you're playing the slow ball, as though you're going to dink it, and then at the last second, add that little bit of speed. Here it is from the side view. Again, everything happening out front between my body and the net. We want that identical setup. Look at that, it's pretty similar on both sides, that's good. The wrist, the body, the feet, the grip, the paddle face all staying the same until the very last moment. As we go forward, you'll see a little bit of a wrist lag, which is needed to get that acceleration, almost like you're throwing the paddle forward toward the ball, but just using your hand. It's almost like if you ever whipped a towel at someone, that's the kind of feeling we want here. We can't afford a great big backswing because that will give away what it is that we're trying to do. And just giving you a few more angles. This is something you can practice on your own, kind of like I am right here. You could use a wall so the ball always comes back to you. You could get a partner, and you could do it with your partner and see if they can guess what it is that's going to come. The important thing is that you try to make it as similar as possible. I even recommend getting out your own camera and taking a look at yourself and see, can you guess what's going to come before it comes? Okay, so there you go. That is the key to having a well-disguised flick, is you've got to set up just like you're going to play a dink. The way you set up your body and your paddle, the way you hold on to the handle, the way your shoulders are, even how far back, especially how far back you pull the paddle before you hit. All these things are going to give cues to your opponent if you're about to flick it. So you want to keep those as constant as possible, make it look like you're going to play a dink, and then surprise them with some speed. One of my favorite things to do is to answer questions from viewers just like you. So before we get to today's questions, why not send me one of your own? Hit me up, Mark at thirdshotsports.com, or send me a note on all the various social media platforms. Okay, very first question, here it is. So what do you do if you're playing pickleball and the person you're playing with refuses to come to the net? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to figure out why they're hanging back in the first place. There are a variety of different reasons that people will choose to stay back after returning serve, and it's important that we understand what those different reasons might be. One of the reasons might be that they just don't understand the tactics of coming forward, why it's so important to return serve and come running to the net. They may not understand that by getting closer to their opponents, they're reducing the time the other team's ball is going to travel before you smack it back. Also, the fact that you can get more high balls when you're near the net. Again, stealing your opponent's time. There's a very good chance that no one has ever explained this to your partner, and so they hit that return of serve and just kind of stand there, right? If they don't understand why coming forward is valuable, how do you expect them to do it? Another reason people sometimes stay back is because they're afraid of the lob. They think that they are covering the back of the court. And so by returning serve and staying back, they're sort of taking the lob out of play, or at least making it a lot easier to handle. At this point, they need to understand that the risk of being lobbed doesn't outweigh the advantages that you can have by coming forward to the net. Unless, of course, you're getting lobbed a lot and it's going very badly for you. Then maybe staying back makes a little bit more sense. So in this case, you need to encourage them to keep coming forward, to not worry about the lob so much, to think about the lob as an opportunity to smack a high ball. After all, that's why you're at the net, right? So you need to understand that they're doing something that they think is helpful, protecting against the lob. You just need to help them see the light. And the third reason people might stay back is because they are afraid of getting hit. Maybe they've been hit before. Maybe they had a close call. Often people stay back because they're scared that the ball might come too fast at them, that their volley skills aren't good enough. So sometimes there's a real fear factor here. This is going to be a tough one to overcome in a short period of time, because if they're scared about coming forward, if they're scared about getting hit, it's going to be tough to really improve their volley skills very quickly so that fear goes away. My point is, you can't help change someone's behavior if you don't understand why they're doing that behavior in the first place. So it's really important to ask your partner in a non-threatening, non-judgmental way. You say, hey, I've noticed that after you return the serve, you often stay back. Can you tell me why? Can you tell me what you're thinking about when you do that? And the way they answer that question will give you some insight. Maybe they are afraid about being hit. Maybe no one's explained to them why it's important to come forward. Or maybe they're worried about that pesky lob. But you can only help to answer the question if you ask it in the first place. Okay, so what's better, a third shot drop or a third shot drive? Well, I think it depends. Look, drops are incredibly risky shots. A little too high or a little too fast and they get slammed by your opponent. A little too low or a little too slow and of course it's in the net. So drops are very risky. Drives, on the other hand, you don't usually have to hit a perfect drive or else suffer major consequences. Yeah, you gotta get it back over the net and keep it in play, but it doesn't have to be perfect as often as a drop does. So drops are more difficult to execute and the margin for error is a lot less. We should also think about the outcome. What is the best case scenario when you play a good drop? Well, you've given a slow moving ball right to your opponent. It's not often going to cause a whole lot of trouble for them, although of course they can miss those shots occasionally. But what's the best possible outcome when you hit a good drive? Well, that your opponents miss altogether, or maybe pop up a high ball. So the reward that you get for hitting an excellent drive is usually more significant than the reward you get for hitting an excellent drop. And again, keeping in mind, drives are usually easier to hit than drops. So what's my suggestion? Well, my suggestion is you go and you test the waters. You see how it goes. You play those drives, smack it hard at your opponents, and see what happens. If they get the ball back in play, well, that's okay. That's not necessarily a red flag. It's if they get the ball back in play and they cause trouble for you. If they counterattack, if they use your own speed against you and they're causing problems for you, well, now maybe you have to say that the drive is not such a great option. You need to look at other choices, like the drop. But I wouldn't suggest you fall into the trap of assuming that the drop is the best play. Again, it's high risk and low reward most of the time. So go out and use the drop if you have to, if your opponent's net gains are so good that the drive doesn't pay any dividends for you. But you'll never know unless you try the drive and make your calculation from there. This is a great question. I've heard of a number of people who use different paddles when they play singles or when they play doubles. And usually it has to do with the different tactics related to each of the games. Here, let me explain. All right, so I grabbed this old bad boy from my basement. It's been a while since we've seen this kind of Maxima, isn't it? But I wanted to pull this out because this was the first one of the first ones at least, in pickleball to be really long and narrow, the Maxima. And a lot of players would use this when they played singles. Now, if we compare that to this guy, okay, one of my favorite paddles right now, the S2 Vanguard 2.0 series, okay? Now, if we compare the two, you'll see there's some important differences here, but let's look at the most important. Okay, so the most important difference here is the length. You are going to have more reach when you're playing with this old Maxima than you would with this S2, right? And that's because how much surface area, this is a nice rough feeling surface. How much surface area you have really matters. The narrower the paddle you make, the longer it can be. Now, why would you want a longer paddle? Well, longer paddles give you more reach, right? And that's really important when you're playing singles and you're all by your lonesome out on the court. You've got to cover a lot of territory yourself. So having a little bit more reach can actually be very attractive. Now, there's another reason too. When you play doubles pickleball, there's a lot of these bang-bang exchanges right up close to the net, these reflex volleys where the ball comes really quickly. And in that case, where you have very little time to react, it's nice to have something that's like got a nice big sort of squarish kind of surface area in case you get those little mishits off center, right? This is a pretty forgiving shape of a paddle. Now, compare that to this old Maxima. Well, look, the sweet spot here is pretty tiny. If you hit this ball a little bit off center here or a little bit off center here, you're going to have some problems. Now, in doubles pickleball, there's a lot of those bang-bang rallies, right? Where you don't have much time to react and you might need a little bit more forgiveness that something like this might offer you. But in singles, there's less of that, where both players are up near the net smacking the ball at each other. It's typically more about one person at the baseline trying to hit a passing shot, for example. And so since you have more time to react in a lot of scenarios in singles, maybe, some people say, you don't need to have so much forgiveness for those off-center hits. Maybe you're going to have fewer of those because often in singles you have more time to react. So in that case, a slightly longer paddle, you get the benefit of the longer reach. And yeah, it's a little narrower, maybe a little less forgiving, but maybe you don't need it quite so much. One more thing to say has to do with leverage. You can get more leverage when you're using this longer paddle. And in singles, the serve is so important. It's important in doubles too, but it's so important in singles because if you can make your opponent hit a poor return, then you're more likely to be able to hit a third shot past them, right? And having this longer paddle, which gives you a little bit more leverage, means you might be able to whip that serve a little bit harder, a little bit deeper, a little bit more spin, creating that opportunity. So there used to be a lot of people, I see fewer and fewer of them now, but who said, hey, when I play singles, I'm going to use this kind of a paddle that gives me more leverage, that yeah, it's less forgiving, but I have more reach because I need it in singles. And when I'm going to go out and play doubles, something like this. All right, so you'd like a more consistent drop? No problem. I mean, I would like that too. Who wouldn't like a more consistent drop? Well, what would I do to suggest? There's a few things about the geometry of the courts to keep in mind. One is when you're hitting cross court, you're actually giving yourself more room to work with, right? The distance on the diagonal is longer than on the down the line. So you're actually going to have a bigger margin for error when you hit those balls cross court than if you hit straight ahead. Second, the net over the middle of the court is lower than at the side of the court. And when you hit down the line, you're hitting over the highest part of the net. Whereas when you hit diagonally, you're hitting over the lower part. My third suggestion is that you really care about how you set up to the ball. How well you set up, how unbalanced you are can make a really big difference when it comes to playing your third shot drop. Or I guess fifth shot drop or seventh shot drop. You know what I mean. The setup matters. You have to be so precise when you hit those drops that if you're reaching or if you're off balance, sorry, I knocked the table there. If you're reaching or if you're off balance, it's a lot harder to be as precise as you need to be when playing that drop. So yes, you should think about how you're sending the ball, but you should really concentrate on how you're receiving it. And finally, I suggest that you think about the drop and drive being kind of similar to one another. How many forehands or backhands have you hit on a pretty flat trajectory in your life? Probably quite a few. So my suggestion is to think about the drop or drive as having that same kind of technique, just a little bit slower, allowing the ball then to dip down, right? Gravity can do its work. So try thinking about the drop as being almost like a baby drive, right? A slow drive, keeping that ball relatively straight, and so with that low target over the net, and then allowing gravity to do its thing to get it down low. All right, so if we do a little recap, if you're playing with someone who stays back all the time, you should ask them why. Not in a judgmental way, but just try to get a sense from them. Why is it that you're staying back after the return? What are you trying to accomplish? Tell me about it. And then think about what you're going to do next from there. When it comes to third shot drops or third shot drives, I suggest you start with the drive. They're easier to do and the rewards can be a lot greater. If your opponents have shown you that they can not only handle your drive but punish you with it, then maybe think about using something like a drop. Some people like longer paddles for singles and some like wider paddles for doubles because there's more bang action when you play doubles, and when you're playing singles you want to have that reach because you got to cover the whole court by yourself. It's also nice to be able to hit your serve a little harder. And if you want to have a more consistent drop, think about cross-court being your friend. You got a lower net, you got a longer distance to work with, care about how well you set up for the ball, and finally, think about your drop as really being kind of like a baby drive, just a slower version of it. All right, do you have a question for me? I'd love to know about it. Send me an email, mark@thirdshotsports.com, and maybe we'll feature you right here on the show. Being able to hit a good deep return of serve is a really important skill for a couple of reasons. If your opponents are on or behind the baseline and they're far away from you, that means that if they choose to drive the ball, you're going to have a lot of time to see it and to get ready for it. And if they choose to play a third shot drop, well, they've got to be really precise from a long way away. And so a deep return of serve is a good way to keep yourself out of trouble, to make it so that even if your opponents do hit some sort of shot to you, well, you've got lots of time to handle it. Let's look at one way that we can measure our ability to hit that ball deep on a consistent basis. Here I grab my friend Andrea, and we're going to rally down the line baseline to baseline. The goal for her is to hit the ball deep enough and fast enough that I'm making contact either on or behind the baseline. This is sort of simulating a return of serve. I know it's not exactly perfect, but you get the idea. Can she consistently push me back far enough that I'm behind the baseline or on the baseline? If she does, we'll consider that a good deep return of serve. And you can see so far, she's doing a really great job. Better than me, actually, considering I hit that ball out. This would be an example of a short return of serve, a short ground stroke. You can see I had to move inside the baseline to get it. She's going to want to minimize those. And now she's back to hitting good, deep balls. I like this idea of pushing your opponents farther back, because it doesn't require that you hit to a specific spot on the court. A ball could be hit a little bit shorter, but if it's fast enough, we'll still keep the opponents back. We can think a little bit about what it is that controls the depth of the ball. The height matters. All things being equal, a ball that goes higher will travel farther than a ball that goes lower, at least as long as it's less than a 45-degree angle. The ball speed also matters. Everything else being equal, a faster ball will travel farther than a slower ball. And the third variable is the spin on the ball. Assuming that the height and the speed are the same, the ball that has top spin will drop sooner. It will be a shorter ball. A ball that has backspin will float and will go a little bit farther. So I encourage you to go out and try this with a friend. See how many in a row you can hit using your forehand and backhand that force your opponent to be on or behind the baseline.